there are some things in our environment that just happen to us, but by and large, that's not the way we experience the environment. A lot more of it has to do with us and the way we interact with the environment. And I think our measures are all based on this antiquated view of the organism as passive and the environment is what happens to us from out there. Whereas I think what we need is what I call active construction of experience, ways in which we use the environment.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Great, well, it's my pleasure.
I really enjoyed reading your book, which is all about genetics and DNA and how that affects us, not just in a physical or biological sense, but also our psychology, our personality traits, even psychopathology and things along those lines. And I'd really like to discuss some of the core concepts of the book, and you also talk about where this could go, what's the future, what does the future look like in this subject area. But before we do that, maybe you could tell us a bit about your background and what attracted you to genetics research.
Well, one aspect of the book is how the environment works. And the bottom line there is chance is a much bigger factor than people are willing to admit. And so my story, as I think in other people you've interviewed, there are these sliding door moments, tipping points that seem to be like chance, although it's sometimes said that chance is, being prepared and having the opportunity come up. But nonetheless, my story has a lot to do with chance. I grew up in inner city Chicago. No one in my family went to university, but I went to Catholic school because it was the nearest school. And there they were big on testing, and I loved school and did well. So they gave me a scholarship to go to this academy, DePaul Academy, and then I got a scholarship to go to university. And then I had a wonderful advisor who told me about graduate school. He said, "Are you going to apply for graduate school?" I said, I honestly didn't know what it was. So that was fortuitous. And the most fortuitous aspect of this was, well, as an undergraduate, I worked full time and I was just taking courses that fit my schedule. So I was in English for a while and film and then philosophy. And there's a story there how I got turned off to philosophy and decided if you want to be empirical, you have to do psychology. So I decided to switch to psychology. And then this advisor actually helped me fill out applications for graduate school. So I heard in January, you're not supposed to hear it till April, but I heard just after submitting my application from the University of Texas at Austin, and they said the magic words, they'll pay you to go to graduate school. So that sounded like a good deal. So I decided to go to graduate school. But what I didn't know is that the University of Texas at Austin had the only program in behavioral genetics in the world. And we were required as graduate students, there's a big program, about 40 new graduate students every year. And we had to take these core courses that went from perception to social psychology, clinical, personality, cognitive, neuroscience. And one of those at Texas, unlike any other place, was behavioral genetics. And so that was very fortuitous. But the weird thing is, and I really can't explain this, there were 40 students in that class. And from the first lectures, it floored me. The idea of genetic influence in psychology in the early 70s was just amazing to me. I was flabbergasted. I did an undergraduate major in psychology in the end, and we never heard about genetics. And so the power of genetics, even in the early 70s, where it was mostly animal work, really floored me. And I just knew that's what I wanted to do. I was tremendously excited about it. But the puzzle is why none of the other 39 students took any notice of it. So I don't know what's that about. I look back and say, was I prepared for that or what? But I really honestly don't know what made me decide, not just decide, it just kind of engulfed me. I knew that was what I wanted to do. So I was very lucky because that was just the beginning of the modern phase of behavioral genetics, that is studying genetic influences on behavior. And for the next 20, 30 years, it was a matter of convincing psychologists that genetics was important. And I think we went a long way in that direction. People now, I think, are much more accepting of the idea that both nature and nurture are important. But back then in the 70s, you honestly didn't hear about genetics. We were actually taught that schizophrenia, for example, was caused by what your mother did to you in the first few years of life. It was just assumed.
Schizophrenogenic mothering.
Yeah, it was just assumed that it's all environmental. So that was like 30 years of my career, keeping my head down, doing the research, hoping psychology would remain an empirical science, and in the end, they'd be persuaded by data, rather than yelling and screaming at each other. I didn't think you were going to teach old dogs new tricks, but the hope was, with a long view on it, I wrote textbooks on behavioral genetics. I hoped in the end, students would come along saying, well, what's all the fuss about? Of course, genetics is important too. It's not all genetic, but genetics is important. So I would have been happy if that was my career. But then along at that time in the 90s, along came the DNA revolution. And that really is changing everything. And I'm sure we'll get on to that later, because we now have the ability to predict some of the genetic liability at the level of the individual. So it's been an exciting ride. And I can't, I always say I'm going to go out feet first, because it's so exciting now. The thought of hanging up my towel just doesn't, I couldn't even contemplate the possibility.
Yeah, now it seems like genetics now is really the very much the right time and place where these things are all accelerating to a previously unprecedented degree. I wonder, I'm interested in what you said about being by yourself in this class of 40 people, being the only one fascinated by this area. It makes me think maybe of the temperament of the people who study psychology, and this kind of relates to what you discuss in the book, that I think people who are interested in psychology are often interested in people and their emotions and their psychological profile, and they don't necessarily intuitively make the links between that and some of the more hardcore aspects of that biology. And really, you've been fighting that counterintuitive approach for your entire career, trying to convince people to go against the natural intuitive understanding of how a person might think or work.
Yes. Well, I really agree with that. As I said, I've kept my head down for 30 or 40 years, but I decided to write this book, Blueprint, because having been in the field for 50 years, I felt it was time now. We knew enough that I was willing to put my head up above the parapet and say, look, guys, genetics is tremendously important, and it tells us a lot about the environment. These are really big findings. So I wanted people to know about it, especially because I wanted to give people the literacy they need to join the conversation about the DNA revolution, which is going to impact all of us. So when the book was published in 2019, the paperback was, and I was kind of holding my breath because some friends of mine told me it was a professional suicide note, that things hadn't changed as much as I thought. Like 20, 30 years ago, there was this knee-jerk reaction: genetics bad, environment good.
Why do you think that was?
There's lots of reasons for it, but psychology, since the 1920s, American psychology at least, had switched from towards a behaviorism that accepted environmentalism, because it came out of stimulus response sort of theory, where you study rats and you do something to them and you look at how they respond. So environmentalism was taking off then, but then of course, with the Second World War and Nazi Germany, the idea of genetics, became a forbidden topic in a way. And interestingly, in psychology was much slower to come around to genetics than psychiatry, where in the 1960s, there was an adoption study of schizophrenia, for example. And I think you can't work with a lot of people and not consider the possibility that there are some genetic propensities, not single gene deterministic factors, but some people have more of a propensity to be depressed. That is, we all have knocks in life, stresses and daily hassles, but some of us are more affected by that. So I think it was sort of a return, the idea that we are what we learn, and that everything, that environmentalism is true, that everything we are is what the environment did to us. It just beggars belief at some level, And what's interesting about the book coming out is I still get flack from academics, sociologists, people in education, which is the last bastion of anti-genetic feeling. But from the public, and I've given probably 50 talks to public groups, there isn't that knee-jerk reaction against genetics. People are interested in it. And more I get people saying, yeah, that really makes sense to me, that both nature and nurture are important. And why has nature been ignored for a century? So I think things really are changing, but what will change it for sure is the DNA revolution. Because you can argue with twin studies and adoption studies, but you can't really argue with DNA, or it's very hard to.
Yeah, and the other thing is, let's say, like, I'm very interested in psychotherapy, so I'm very interested in how people can change in a positive direction. But the way I see it is, it's much harder to make positive change if you have a poor understanding of your nature. The better understanding one has of one's nature, and that obviously involves genetics and other things, the more one is in a better position to make a much more sophisticated plan as to how someone can change and navigate difficult problems.
Yeah. The best example for me was on the DNA side of things. I describe in the book the world's first polygenic score profile. That is, these risk scores based on thousands of DNA differences that predict hundreds of different traits, including psychopathology. But a concrete one is obesity. And it's actually body mass index, which is another story about dimensions and disorders that we'll get into later, because it's an important implication for psychiatry. But with obesity, my highest polygenic score was for obesity. I'm at the 94th percentile for genetic risk. And some people say, well, then you just say, you give up, you say, well, I'm a genetic fatty, there's nothing I can do about it. But to the contrary, for me, and I find for other people as well, it's actually motivating, just along the lines you're saying, that I know I have a genetic propensity to put on weight, meaning to eat like a pig, and it's harder for me to take the weight off. And it's good for me and motivating to know that it's a lifelong battle of the bulge. It isn't just losing, a few pounds here and there. I've got to engineer my environment to make it easier for me to resist the siren call of high energy junk food late at night, that sort of thing. So it's exactly as you say. I think by knowing our nature, it will make it easier for us to navigate our way through the environment. But more than that, more specifically, a big area of research, especially in pharmacogenetics, is personalized, individualized treatment instead of one-size-fits-all treatments, to personalize treatments. And that includes psychiatric treatments. There's a lot of work now looking at CBT versus drug treatments for depression. Wouldn't it be fantastic to know ahead of time that certain people with certain genetic propensities, whatever they are, might be more likely to respond positively to CBT and maybe negatively to drugs, and vice versa. So I think you put your finger on the key aspect of this in terms of psychiatry.
Exactly. It's to be very relevant in psychiatry and psychology. As a clinician, one of the most daunting issues is to try and match patient to treatment. Will this particular medication or will this particular therapy or social intervention work for this particular patient? And we have ways of trying to predict that, but they're just not very sophisticated. And I think genetics would offer a much more sophisticated way of being able to do that.
And one way in particular is that all of the predictors you talk about are symptomatic. We try to divide depression up into different types of symptoms. In fact, our whole diagnostic scheme is based on symptoms. And for the first time, really, genetics offers us an etiological indicator. And that's a big deal. And it's a special one, too, in that unlike our other predictors in psychology and psychiatry, inherited DNA differences don't change from the moment of conception, so that you can predict early in life. And the reason the DNA revolution is really taking hold in medicine is because it's kind of a no-brainer that instead of waiting for someone to have a heart attack, you can predict and prevent heart attacks. And I think that same sort of model of prevention is where psychiatry needs to go.
Yes.
Some work in schizophrenia shows if you can prevent or at least ameliorate the first episode of a psychotic episode, it's got to be better than just waiting until someone has full-blown disorders and then try to cure it. Because as we know with obesity and alcoholism, it's very hard to cure those.
Yes, and I think, for example, taking the example of schizophrenia from my clinical experience, I would say that just anecdotally, seeing patients who have, the more psychotic episodes they have and the more prolonged they are, the worse the prognosis seems to be. So that I would say that very much fits with my clinical experience. So we've talked around, a lot of the main topics in the book, but what would you say, what's the central thrust of the book that you want, particularly the layperson, to be aware of?
Yes. Well, I was just listening to a podcast by this guy, John Horton. I don't know if he wrote a book a couple decades ago that was very popular called The End of Science. And he's had an updated version a few years ago. And on this podcast, he was talking about how science hasn't really produced as much. It's a lot of hype more than, real progress. And he always singles out, and this irritates me so much, psychiatry. He says, we don't know any more about psychiatry now than we did 50 years ago. And that's so wrong in a lot of ways. But one important way is 50 years ago, people thought psychiatric problems were all environmental. We now accept that they're not all environmental. There's a strong genetic component. And the genetic agenda has been progressive, in that we're making real progress. We can only now predict maybe 8% of the liability to schizophrenia with DNA, but that's only in the last few years. And there's no way, the only way is up here. We're only going to predict more and more of the variants. So I think just the shift from environmentalism to a more balanced view that recognizes the importance of nature, genetics, as well as nurture, environment, is important. But, that's what the title of the book is about, which was suggested by my editor, and it's provocative, of course. It's Blueprint, how DNA makes us who we are. Now, it should say, as individuals, of our 3 billion base pairs of DNA, not over 99% are the same for all of us, identical. That's what makes us human. We're talking about the 1% of those 3 billion base pairs that differ between us from inheritance, from the first cell with which we began life. And so we're talking about how DNA makes us who we are as individuals, but that's what we're onto in psychology and psychiatry. Why are some people schizophrenic and others not? But the message should be that DNA is the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals, because genetic research provides the best evidence we have for the importance of the environment, because heritability, that is the effect size of inherited DNA differences, is about 50%, plus or minus 10%, 40% per person.
Sorry, could you briefly explain what heritability is?
Yeah, I had the book Blueprint was probably at least twice as long before my editor got her hands on it. And I had a whole chapter on what is heritability, because I find that's the most misunderstood concept. But she made me, I don't know if you noticed, but the back has about 50 pages of very small print notes. Well, that's a lot of the stuff that I had in the book that she made me take out, probably rightfully so, because it's still a relatively difficult book for a supposedly popular book. So heritability is, as I say, the most misunderstood concept. The main thing is it's about individual differences. So people might be surprised if you ask people how heritable is eye color, even if they don't really know technically what that is, heritability, they'd say it's mostly heritable, 90%. But when you get to things like more closer to psychology, like body weight, body mass index, people underestimate genetic influence by about half. And your listeners might be surprised to know that body mass index is about 70% heritable. But what that means is it doesn't refer to one individual like me. It doesn't mean I am this nearly 18-stone creature, 70% because of genetics and 30% because of environments. It refers to differences in a particular population at a particular time. So it's describing differences that exist now with the genetic differences among us, as well as the environmental differences. People like me always on diets and worried about their weight, other people not worried. So it refers to differences in a population and it describes them, and it's specific to the population you study.
It's a snapshot.
It is, yeah. And so heritability, like means and variances, are descriptive statistics that change as the population changes. It's not a constant like the speed of light. The other mistake people make is thinking about it as deterministic. If something's genetic, that means it's innate, immutable, hardwired, deterministic, which leads to this fatalism, which is all wrong. And the reason for that historically is that we all learned about genetics from Mendel. And Mendel studied single gene disorders in pea plants. If you get that mutation he studied for wrinkled seeds, you will, and you were a pea plant, you'd have wrinkled seeds. It's deterministic and hardwired. It doesn't matter about your environment. But when we talk about complex traits like body weight or all the things we study in psychology and psychiatry, all the common disorders and complex traits, they show strong genetic influence, but there's no evidence for important influence of any single gene, any major gene. We're talking about tiny effects from thousands, literally thousands of these DNA differences. So that changes it from sort of pre-programmed hardwired determinism of a single gene to probabilistic propensities. Mm-hmm. It's all quantitative rather than either or. And that's hard for people to get their heads around. They want to think in terms of black and white, and either you have this or you don't. And so that's the other misconception, and there's a third one I should just mention, and that is we're dealing with the normal range of variation that we study. So my twin study, Ted's twins early adoption study, which I've been studying for 25 years since I've come to England, probably represents about 95% of the population on most of the demographic characteristics. But we're unlikely to have parents who agreed for us to study their kids if the parents are abusive or severely neglecting the children. So, that's all we can generalize to is the sample we study. So all bets are off when we say heritability is tremendously important, because if, say with weight, it's highly heritable, but obviously if you didn't feed me, I'd lose weight. We're talking about what is in a particular population at a particular time, rather than what could be if we change the environment.
Exactly. So the first point about heritability, so if I said the heritability of weight in the population of the UK in 1996 is 70%, then that means that among that population in 1996, about 70% of the differences in weight would be explained by genetic rather than environmental factors.
And by genetics, we mean inherited DNA differences. The word genetic is much broader than that.
I see. Okay. And then the second point that you made is that a lot of the traits we're talking about are complex traits, where a given trait is influenced by a whole multitude of genes, which each exert a small effect, as opposed to rarer conditions where one gene, for example, Huntington's disorder, exerts a very pronounced effect just by itself.
Yes. And on that, there are thousands, some people say 10,000 single gene disorders, and many of them have neurological and some behavioral effects, but these are often very rare, and they're dramatically important for the people who have them, like Huntington's disease you mentioned. And there are hundreds of single gene mutations that affect cognitive development, for example. But the hard thing for people to understand is that those single genes have huge effects on a small number of individuals, but their effect in the population as a whole is not great.
And then the third point you mentioned is that, and this is what I'm really fascinated by, how nature and nurture interact with each other, that as the environment changes, heritability actually changes. So if you take a country that is very deprived of calories in general, that calorie-deprived environment won't allow the genetic differences between people to express themselves. So you won't have, for example, very overweight people, people in the middle, and people who remain of normal weight or underweight. But rather people will be in a much more narrow band of weight. And then if you look at countries with a very diverse range of calories where people can get as much calories as they want, that actually increases the heritability because the full range of genetic differences are allowed to express themselves.
Yeah, just so. The first part of what you said is with severe nutritional deprivation, heritability might be zero. Well, it depends. It depends on, it's an interesting empirical question as to whether that occurs. And what's amazing to me is how across the world, in many different types of environments, you do tend to find substantial heritability. So it could be even with nutritional deprivation, the differences that remain, they're not as great. You don't have obese people, as you say, but there still are differences in weight, and they still could be substantially due to inherited DNA differences. So these are interesting empirical questions, and people are beginning to study them as we move beyond our convenience samples of people of Northern European ancestry, which is about 90% of all genetic and genomic, that is DNA studies.
Mm-hmm. And now moving more into psychology, just to give people a flavor of just how influential these inherited differences are, what are some of the differences psychologically that are affected by our inherited DNA differences?
Well, it's much easier to turn that around and ask what is not. I mean, it's an amazing thing, from the 70s, when I was in graduate school, people in the field would gingerly say, well, we think cognitive development is all environmental, but isn't it possible that because it involves the brain, maybe there's some genetic influence? And here's a study that says it shows quite a lot of genetic influence. We've gone from that to now saying, I don't know of a single psychological trait that's been studied in a genetically sensitive design that does not show significant genetic influence. And it's not just statistically significant. Really, there's this amazing meta-analysis of something like 3,000 twin studies that look at traits across the life sciences, from physical and biochemical and physiological to psychological traits. And on average, across thousands of studies, the average heritability is 50%, meaning that about half of the differences between people are due to genetic differences. Then if you focus down on psychology, the range is quite small in heritability. You go from about 40% for personality traits to about 60% for cognitive traits. And it should be pointed out that provides important evidence for the environment because it's not all genetic. However, we should stop and take notice of that 50%, because in psychology, it's rare that we find effects that account for 5% of the differences. For example, we think about boys and girls differ in verbal and spatial ability. That difference accounts for 1% of the individual differences in kids' performance on verbal and spatial tests. In other words, if all you know about a kid is whether they're a boy or girl, you don't know anything about their verbal ability or their math ability. In contrast to that, we're talking about 50% of the variance. It's off the scale of effect sizes in the behavioral sciences. And that's what's made it possible to begin to identify some of the DNA differences responsible for that heritability. So the answer to your question is it's really much better to turn the question around now. And the challenge is to find any trait reliably measured in a sufficiently powerful genetic design that shows no significant genetic influence, because I'm honestly not aware of a single one.
And I think people do struggle with this a bit when we talk about traits, for example, like how hardworking someone is, how sociable someone is, and getting even more controversial, things like intelligence and cognitive ability. And of course, we know about books like The Bell Curve, written by Charles Murray, that's caused a lot of controversy. I think people are very used to looking at someone's behavior and their actions and trying to make some sort of moral evaluation of that person on that basis. And so I do think, like you mentioned earlier, they find the idea that genetics influence a lot of these traits quite deterministic.
Yes, but as we've said, a deterministic interpretation is wrong. These are probabilistic propensities. And along those lines, I mentioned that my polygenic score for body mass index is at the 94th percentile. Well, I'm at the 70th percentile, and I think I deserve credit for, not being at my genetic level of obesity. So it isn't deterministic, and body weight's such a good thing. You skinny guys probably don't recognize that us fatties, it isn't just, people say, oh, well, it's just free will. It just get a grip, have some self-control, and that's sort of what you were saying, is people make moral judgments about people, because they think it's all due to free will. Well, it is free will. Like when I'm out at a restaurant with friends and, people are all done and there's food left on the table. I don't want any more. I'm not hungry. But as we talk, all of a sudden the food's all gone. and that's me. And yeah, sure, I didn't have to do that. I could have said no. But, when you're not thinking, you're talking to friends, you're having a good time, it just slips in. And that's the way it works. Genetics isn't like a master puppeteer pulling our strings. It's just these sort of whispers, or not even whispers. It's sort of like subconscious processes. I don't even know that I ate that food because I said I'm not hungry. I don't need any more. And then I end up eating the food.
It's a tendency or a predisposition.
Yeah, and psychologists talk about two processes. They're a satiety thing where you feel full, and maybe I don't feel full the way other people feel full. Some people, like you, maybe being very thin, I'm envious, with probably, when you say you're full, you probably couldn't eat anymore. I mean, you'd feel maybe a little sick if you ate more. Doesn't happen to me.
Robert, I have news for you. I'm in exactly the same position as you. I have a pronounced tendency to gain weight.
No way.
When I was 19, I weighed something like 100 kg.
Whoa.
Yeah. And now I'm more like 70 kg through strict, very careful control of diet and exercise. So I very much relate to your example. I very much recognize that I have this disposition. I have a very large appetite.
Really?
But and then the other thing is, and I'd really like to talk about this, it's like what we often perceive as a weakness is often a strength and a weakness at the same time. And I think this applies a lot to psychology. Keeping to the example of weight, for instance, yes, the tendency to put on weight can be potentially troublesome when we're talking about body fat. But if you're talking about muscle, it's extremely useful. And I think they tend to come together. So a person might have a high predisposition to gain weight in terms of body fat, but if that person was also lifting a lot of weight and eating a lot of protein, that disposition would translate into gaining a lot of muscle instead, or at least alongside body fat. And that's tremendously helpful for lots of reasons.
Yeah, even at a physiological level, do you know the evolutionary argument? I don't know how true it is, but that one of the largest of these tiny gene effects is FTO. It's a gene on chromosome 16. And it has a long evolutionary history. And a mutation came up that spread through ancient populations. And populations today that have a high incidence of that are much more likely to gain fat. And it was thought that in the Stone Age, when you didn't know when your next meal was coming along, a mutation that made it easier for you to store fat was a good thing. And nowadays, in a fast food nation, where you're bombarded with food cues, it's not a good thing. But it does make the point that few of these things are totally good or totally bad. And especially when there are thousands of these DNA differences that affect the traits, it's probably trade-offs and balances all over the place.
Yeah, and similarly, let's talk more about psychological traits. I think about a trait like emotional sensitivity, for instance, which in the Big Five theory would be classified as neuroticism, which it's not the best word for PR.
No, it's not.
But let's call it emotional sensitivity. It's
Yes.
often seen as a weakness, but emotional sensitivity is profoundly helpful in that it makes you very good at gauging the group of people that you're in. It puts you in a better position to maintain social harmony. It's probably very good for childcare because you need to be sensitive to the needs of the people around you, including your children. So, as you say, it's not this black and white thing. It's not about solutions and problems, but it's more about trade-offs. You know,
Yes.
let's take a trade that people think is really good, like being a hard worker. Being a hard worker conveys many advantages, but we all know people who work too hard and too extreme, and they can suffer tremendously as well. They may find it difficult to maintain their relationships. They can get excessively stressed out, etc., etc.
hmm Well, this allows me to introduce a related topic with these polygenic scores. Because there are thousands of DNA differences involved, they're always perfectly normally distributed. But in psychiatry, we focus on the problem end. So with, say, emotional sensitivity, we could be talking about that more in the neurotic sense of, and it correlates a lot genetically with depression, for example. Well, this polygenic score isn't a score for depression. It's a score for a normal distribution. And that means there's a low end as well as a high end. And if you only think of it as a problem and vulnerability and a risk, you don't think about what's at the other end. And it may be at the other end, there's also problems. For example, with obesity, I think that at the low end, it isn't just low risk for obesity, it's maybe a risk for eating disorders. Maybe it makes you more finicky about food and more easily disgusted by food, for example. And with attention and hyperactivity, we might think of that's a risk for ADHD. But what about the low end? Could it be that maybe there's too much attention and compulsiveness and, but no one studies that other end of this normal distribution. So I think that's one growth area for research, to realize that we're dealing with normal distributions. The other aspect of that I'm sure we'll get into is that I think it's the final nail in the coffin of diagnosis.
Of categorical diagnosis.
Yes.
Yes. Let's talk about that. So in the book, one of your slogans is "the abnormal is normal." And that's something this idea is something I've been thinking about for a while. So why don't you explain to the listeners what that is?
Yes. Well, to move to the bottom line here, as I've said, these polygenic scores are normally distributed, and genetics accounts for a lot of the liability to psychopathology. From a genetic point of view, there are no disorders, there are only dimensions. That is, it's not qualitative, a dichotomous decision between affected or not. It's a continuous distribution. There's no break point. And one thing that's interesting about that is it means, like for schizophrenia, we all have thousands of tiny DNA risks to be diagnosed as schizophrenic. It's not a matter of them versus us. It's all us. It's just all quantitative, a matter of more or less rather than either or. And I do think when I first came to the Institute 25 years ago, I was very delicate about this idea that common disorders, are dimensions, the idea that the abnormal is normal, because so many people in psychiatry have invested their careers on the idea of diagnosing whether someone has the disorder or not. It's the medical model, and that works if you have a single, simple cause. And that's why in medicine, if there's a new epidemic around, you want to know it's a virus, and it's the SARS-2 virus, and it causes it's necessary and sufficient. You don't have COVID-19 unless you were infected by SARS-2. So it's necessary and sufficient for a disorder to occur. So their diagnosis is key. You've got to say who's got COVID-19 and who doesn't. So, and the asymptomatic cases really screwed things up because, it was hard symptomatically to decide whether they are cases or not. But I do think it's held psychiatry back because we don't have simple causes. And so we're pretending that people have a disorder or not. That's not true. We're trying to find a cure for the disorder, and that's not true. I mean, if there is no disorder, there's no disorder to cure. We can alleviate symptoms, but we're not curing an etiological single cause sort of disorder. So I do think that even though we're so invested in diagnosis with DSM-5 and ICD-10, I do really think it's holding us back. And I'm disappointed that with DSM-5, there was a major attempt to try to shadow a continuous dimensional approach. And it fell by the wayside, I think, primarily for vested interests. But it is the way it's going to go. And I think the DNA revolution will help put the nail in the coffin of diagnosis.
So by vested interests, do you mean just people who have, like you say, have spent their whole careers resting very much on a categorical model of diagnosis?
Sort of worse than that, sort of insurance companies, where you can understand it, even from the NHS, where insurance isn't a factor. Still, from social services or even as a psychiatrist, before you're going to get a payment, you have to have someone meet these diagnostic criteria. And I'm not saying there aren't people with problems. I'm asking, what is it we gain by pretending it's ideologically simple and people either have it or they don't? Why can't we think quantitatively? Because as a working psychiatrist, you do think quantitatively, on all these symptom dimensions, even though DSM-3 says you need 3 of these symptoms for 2 months and 1 of those for 5 months, these sorts of things. You make a judgment about how severe someone is and how much it affects their functioning in life, which isn't a matter of the symptoms. I think that's a major factor, is how much it affects you in your functioning in life. So I don't want to go off too much on this, but I'm interested to see how receptive psychiatrists are to this, even though so much of their training and their career has been based on diagnosis.
I mean, I would say, firstly, the medical model we mentioned and the categorical system, its value is reflected most clearly in when it does work. And it does work well when you have these really, really textbook cases, like a textbook case of depression or a textbook case of schizophrenia. And then it feels like everything falls into place. But the problem is, there are so many gray areas. Yeah. There are so many patients who present with a multitude of different kinds of problems with very, like you say, continuous levels of severity, not on or off or black and white. And in that respect, that I think a dimensional approach would be very useful. And even more so in cases around personality, difficulties with personality, more psychological problems, rather than more, let's say, abrupt, acute presentation.
Have you ever considered the possibility, though, that these clear cases you're talking about are statistical anomalies? So, for example, with ADHD, where there's the triad of symptoms that people talk about, we studied them each individually and quantitatively. And if you have 2 of these areas, you're probably worse off in terms of ASD, autistic spectrum disorder. And if you have 3, you're even worse off. But what we showed is these 3 aspects, components of ASD, are not very much correlated with one another. But sometimes you get people with 2 and sometimes with 3, but it's almost like statistical and, and chance. And the people with 3 do worse than the people with 1 or 2, the kids. But if you look at diagnosed ADSD in this sample of kids, those diagnosed kids are not particularly the worst off. Because any one of those things, like communication sorts of problems, if they're very severe, that can make you function less well than someone who happens to just make the diagnostic criteria for ASD. So I'm not even sure that there are clear cases.
Mm-hmm. There are what seems like clear cases, I suppose, and that's where you're liable to get into trouble. That's the problem with having a model of any sort, I suppose, is that the map is not the same thing as the territory.
Exactly right.
The map is a low resolution guide, and sometimes one comes across cases which seem to fit the map better than other cases.
But with ASD, it's interesting. When Kanner in 1945 said there is this triad of symptoms that he's going to call autism, if you look at where's the evidence for that? Well, he had some kids who had all three types of problems, and they were worse off than kids who have two. But that doesn't make it a syndrome. It doesn't mean these three things are etiologically related.
Etiologically, yeah. That's crucial.
Yeah, and that's a big problem because once we diagnose it, it becomes it in our heads, it becomes real. I know, like parents, they with kids with reading problems or ADHD, they're greatly relieved to say, my child has ADHD. And then they're especially impressed when a psychiatrist says, and if you give them speed, methylphenidate, Ritalin, they'll be better. And then the parent could say, but doctor, the kid's already got low attention span. Why are you going to give them speed? And you can wisely say, well, it makes kids who are really ADHD attend more. But those of us who grew up in the 60s know that speed makes you focal. Your attention becomes very focused. So it's wicked, and I particularly study educational performance and that's sort of the business end of cognitive development. And there, this medicalization has gone to ridiculous extremes. You don't just say kids have reading problems. You give it a Greek or Latin name, dyslexia. They don't have math problems. They have dyscalculia. And parents really say, well, my kid has dyslexia. They don't. They have reading problems, So it's more than semantic. I mean, I think it's a fundamental issue.
I mean, I don't even think saying it's a semantic problem is trivial in the sense that language is very, very powerful and it helps us to shape our worlds. Like, why often when I give diagnoses to people, I try and be very careful about how I do so, in the sense I might say something like, this diagnosis seems to be a reasonable description of your problems at this time, as opposed to this is a fixed label from which you can never escape, which I think is often the implicit assumption that takes place when a diagnosis is delivered.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen the recent work by Ashalom Caspi and Timmy Muffet, who are also at our SGDP Center. They have this Dunedin study where they studied 1,000 people for 4 decades of life in New Zealand. And what they show is, for some reason, being in New Zealand, there's a very high incidence of psychiatric problems. But they've traced these people for 40 years. And what they show is, even with diagnoses, severe diagnoses of psychopathology, they're going in and out. And people end up having many different diagnoses. And very rarely does a diagnosis, even like schizophrenia, stick for decades. It's not just that they get better, they get diagnosed with something else. So I think it's also a problem that we think, well, you get a diagnosis and that's it. That's who you are. That's what you are.
Yes, and I see many patients who have attracted so many different diagnoses over the years. And that, as you say, really begs to, it creates a vacuum about etiology that has always needed to be filled in psychiatry. Our diagnoses are based really on outcomes, lists of symptomatic outcomes. So if you take a condition like depression, we diagnose that with 7 or so symptoms like low mood, low energy, poor appetite, disturbed sleep, etc. But there's so many routes to get to that outcome. Some routes might lean more in a kind of environmental direction. Some routes might lead more in a biological direction. Most are likely to be a combination of all those factors. But as it stands now, the diagnosis is not based on cause. And so the research in inherited DNA differences can be very useful. I wondered maybe if you could make things more concrete in terms of the DNA revolution. That's outside of just psychiatry and psychology for now.
Yeah.
What do you think? How do you think the DNA revolution will change our lives?
Well, first, to make sure people understand what I mean, is after 30 years of research showing that everything's heritable significantly, it was clear that the way forward from a scientific point of view was to identify some of those DNA differences. So I started doing that in 1990, but we didn't have the technology to be able to do it. We call it genotype, we could only determine someone's DNA differences for one DNA difference at a time. It was very slow and very expensive. And so we did candidate gene work. We said, well, you're interested in ADHD, methylphenidate affects the dopamine D2 receptor. So let's study genes in dopamine D2. That's a candidate gene approach. And the candidate gene approach was genomics, that is DNA's contribution to the replication crisis. Because of those thousands of studies, no more than chance numbers replicated. They did all the wrong things responsible for the replication crisis, which I won't go into now. But my colleague Stuart Ritchie has a book that came out 6 months ago called Science Fictions, which is all about the replication crisis, what caused it, and how do we cure it. Because if people haven't heard about it, I think it's one of the most important things we have to deal with as a science right now, not just in psychiatry. It's worse in some areas like pharmacology, neuroscience. So that's a very big deal. But then the DNA revolution was led technologically, which I don't like in a way. I like things to be, conceptual advances. But in about 2005, something came along called a SNP chip. It's an array the size of a postage stamp that genotypes not just one, but hundreds of thousands of DNA differences across the genome.
Yeah, so a SNP is like a very, very small DNA difference.
It stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. So a nucleotide is one of the base pairs, these 3 billion steps in the spiral staircase of the double helix of DNA that I talked about. And we all have 4 million or so of these single step differences. So it's the simplest sort of DNA difference, and it's the most common one. And this SNP chip, single nucleotide polymorphism SNP chip array, allows us to genotype quickly, inexpensively, less than 40 quid, for example, hundreds of thousands of DNA differences, SNPs. And the neat thing is then it allows you to take an atheoretical approach, the opposite of a candidate gene approach, and look at SNPs throughout the whole genome to try and do what's called genome-wide association. And when those studies first came out, the first big study was a Wellcome Trust case control study in 2007. It included bipolar disorder, and along with 6 other common medical diseases. And it proved that you can use this approach to find some of the DNA differences responsible for heritability. The problem was that the biggest effects were so much smaller than anyone ever expected. Most people expected you find, a handful of big effects and then a bunch of maybe little effects. But instead, they're all little effects. And they're much littler effects. They're minuscule. The average effect size for, say, schizophrenia, well, for actually any trait, the average effect size of the significant hits, associations, is about 0.01%. That's 0.0001. These are effect sizes, unheard of in the behavioral sciences. And as a result, people realize the only way to find more of these DNA differences is to have much larger studies, because you have to correct for about 1 million multiple tests if people understand how probability levels, depend on if you're doing multiple tests. So it's a whole new ball game, and we're talking about studies like in my area of education, where samples are now over 1 million people.
Yes, and the analogy used in the book, which I think works very well, is it's the difference between looking for gold nuggets and gold dust.
Yes, exactly right. And it'd be nice if we just had a few nuggets to pick up. But what we know for sure is that there are no big effects that account for much variance in the population. This is, again, we're not talking about single gene effects. So that's the DNA revolution, and we're now making progress along those lines. In the behavioral sciences, the trait that we can predict best with DNA. So I didn't make the point that the last step is, even though there are thousands of these SNP differences, you can add them together, aggregate them in what's called a poly, multiple genic score, which is like creating a scale from items. We weight the items, in this case SNPs, by their effect size, how much they're associated with the trait. And so we just keep going down and down the list to smaller and smaller effects. So if they have very tiny effects, they don't add much to the polygenic score. But these polygenic scores then exist for, we routinely create 350 of them, looking for medical things like cardiovascular stuff, immunological stuff, neurological stuff, as well as schizophrenia, bipolar, those are the two biggest areas of genomic research. But increasingly, developmental disorders, ADHD, ASD, are becoming more and more the target of these genome-wide association studies. So we're doing okay on the psychopathology side, but the star by far is cognitive development, and more specifically, educational achievement, which is weird because education is the field that's resisted genetics for a long time, even though we know that cognitive traits are among the most heritable traits. Well, what we've shown in the last couple of years is that we can use polygenic scores to predict 15% of the variance of GCSE scores in England today. Now, those GCSE scores are about 60% heritable, so we have a long way to go. Heritability is the ceiling for this prediction. But 15% is a lot. It's twice as much as we can explain for any psychiatric trait.
So if I can just drill down on this. So if the heritability of GCSE scores is about 60%, meaning 60% of the differences are due to these inherited DNA differences, now 15% of that we've found the actual genes themselves. Is that correct?
No, it's 25% of that. So it's 15% of the total variance. I'm glad you clarified that.
Yeah.
Of the total variance of the individual differences in kids on GCSE scores, 15% can be accounted for by DNA, can be predicted from DNA. And as you say, though, what's 15% of 60% is something like 25%. So
yeah. So of that 60%, we have now identified the genes of about 15%.
Yes, of the total variance. Yes.
Of the total variance.
Yeah. So we got a long ways to go, but this is all in the last couple of years. So I think it is very exciting. And there's a whole industry about what's called missing heritability, the difference between how much we can predict right now with DNA versus how heritable we think these traits are. And I could go into that, but the main thing that's going to happen is whole genome sequencing. These SNP chips are amazing because they can genotype hundreds of thousands of DNA differences, but of a particular type, a SNP. And we deal with the common ones because they're more informative. So it was all very reasonable. But now that we're pushing the envelope so much, looking for smaller and smaller effects, one of the major hypotheses for this missing heritability gap is rare variants. And so we're only looking at the common variants, whereas whole genome sequencing involves sequencing all 3 billion base pairs of DNA. And that's all she wrote in terms of inheritance. That's all we get are those 3 billion base pairs of DNA, which is the same in all the chromosomes in all our cells. So this is really happening now. And there is a study in preprint now that shows that you can explain most of the missing heritability with these rare variants. So I think, we definitely will have polygenic scores that predict a lot more. But I would like to say for people who say, well, you can't really, polygenic scores aren't powerful enough to make predictions, but rarely do we explain 15% of the variance. And what's really interesting to me in education is we spend 60 million a year in the UK to do these Ofsted ratings of schools. So they go in, examiners go into schools for 2 days, they interview everybody, they look at scores, they observe kids in class. They're the best sort of estimates you could get of school quality. And that's what leads to the league tables that lead parents to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds to send their kid to a so-called better school. Well, the question I asked a couple of years ago, how much variance in GCSE scores is explained by these excellent ratings of school quality? And the answer is 4%. 4% versus 15%.
And you would say that's primarily, I think you explained this in the book, that's primarily because these excellent schools select children who are excellent academically in the first place.
Yes, well, there is that as well. But just taking the 4% itself, that's pretty meager compared to the 15%. And very rarely in the behavioral sciences do people pay as much attention to effect size as we do in genetics. And the reason is it often casts a very harsh spotlight on findings where we're always talking about them being statistically significant, but they're not significant in any social sense until they have a large effect size. So I always encourage people, as part of the literacy I'm trying to get across in this book, is to always ask about effect size. Don't just accept that something's statistically significant. Say, how big is the effect?
Yes, because it can run so counter to our intuitions, like our intuition of how important a school environment must be. And again, there's something over the book is our intuition is it must be tremendously important. And I think you say quite eloquently that it matters, that's important, but it doesn't actually explain a lot.
Yeah, well, I got in trouble for that, saying, schools matter, but they don't make a difference. But what I do mean is in terms of individual differences, they don't account for much. Schools obviously matter. That's where kids learn basic numeracy and literacy skills, as well as, I think, as we see in the pandemic, social skills. I think we're going to have a difficulty, kids coming back and trying to be re-socialized, and getting to enjoy being with peers again. So I think schools matter a lot, and good schools are a lot better than bad schools. I think one of the reasons we don't have so much of an effect of schools is that these Ofsted ratings has gotten rid of the worst schools. And so mostly we're dealing with a range of variation that's, good enough. And as you mentioned, and I think it's a very important point, it's a little bit of a digression, but when the kids in the selective schools, the fee-paying schools, they get a whole grade higher average GCSE score than kids in the state schools, the comprehensive schools. And people assume, well, that's environmental. It makes sense, better resources, better paid teachers, that sort of thing. But as you mentioned, what we've shown is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Kids are selected for selected schools based on how well they did at school, and actually how their cognitive ability. And so when you take the best kids and you show they do well at school, you've got to ask, well, how much of that is added value of these expensive selective schools? And the answer is just about nothing. If you correct in the selective schools, if you correct for the traits on which those kids are selected, prior achievement and ability, there's no difference in GCSE scores between the kids in the selective schools and the comprehensive schools. So it's another good example of how any correlation in psychology between an environment, like quality of school, and an outcome is assumed to be causal environmentally. Most notably, the thing that is a risk for my blood pressure is any correlation between parenting and kids' outcomes. We know correlations don't imply causation, sort of, but it's so hard to resist interpreting those correlations causally. What the parents are doing causes the way the kids turn out. But genetics has been very important on that score, showing that to a large extent, parents are responding to genetic differences in their kids rather than causing those differences environmentally. This is the other bumper sticker I call nature of nurture.
Yes, and I suppose there's many aspects to the nature of nurture. Not only is it that, like you say, parental genetic influences have a much more pronounced influence than the environment that they set up for their children, or rather their genetic influences influence the environment that they set up for their children. But also individuals themselves will tend to create environments that suit their genetic propensity. Is that right?
Yes. And this is the general topic of genotype environment correlation. That, and it's what you were saying earlier, is the interplay between genes and environment is important. But many years ago, I talked about 3 types of those. One is a passive type. So kids get environments correlated with their genotypes because the parents provide the environment and genotype. That's what geneticists are focusing on these days. It's a very hot topic called passive gene-environment correlation. But I think that's the least of it. There are 2 other types, reactive or evocative, where people, like teachers, respond to kids based on their genetic propensities. And so it's reactive or evocative. But most important is the one you just alluded to, which never gets studied. And that's an active GE correlation in which kids select, modify, even create environments correlated with their genetic propensities. And if you've ever seen kids who are like gifted at math or gifted at music, you get to appreciate it'd almost be hard to stop them from developing those skills. For music, you don't need to have the world's best teachers. You almost can't stop a kid from humming or listening to the radio or hanging out, or now with Spotify, having access to all the music in the world. So that, I think, the internet, by the way, I think is the best example of this active GE correlation because it requires choice. In psychology, we started, as we said in the first part of this interview, with a stimulus response sort of approach in the 1920s. It's very much the organism is passive. The experimenter does something, shocks the rat. And there are some things in our environment that just happen to us, but by and large, that's not the way we experience the environment. A lot more of it has to do with us and the way we interact with the environment. And I think our measures are all based on this antiquated view of the organism as passive and the environment is what happens to us from out there. Whereas I think what we need is what I call active construction of experience, ways in which we use the environment. And that requires choice, which is hard to measure, but the internet is perfect for that.
Yes, I mean, I'm fascinated by this because, what we know from the psychotherapy literature and what you try to do with someone in psychotherapy is to create a mental shift from one position where the client feels like everything is happening to them and the way they perceive the world is exactly how the world is, to a position of what one might call mental flexibility, where one becomes more aware of what are the things they do to construct different outcomes in their lives, and how are the ways in which they're perceiving the world somewhat distorted. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, we talk about cognitive distortions. Are they missing the whole picture? Do they have a personality predisposition that predisposes them to seeing the world in one particular shade? Yeah. And how can you widen that lens a bit?
I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly right. And one blowback I get from people sometimes saying, well, that isn't the environment, that's just perceptions. But, I think as a psychiatrist, you don't need to be convinced that perception is the way the environment's experienced. It isn't just some amorphous perception. That is how we experience the environment.
Yeah, I mean, our perception of the environment from the point of view of the subject is the environment. It is, from a phenomenological point of view, it is our world. But obviously what that leads to is the next step, which is, can you change that perceptive ability? And you can do it purely with things like talking therapy or activities that involve introspection, like meditation. Now we can do it with certain medications as well. Like the resurgence in the use of psychedelics is very interesting from that perspective, because they directly affect our perceptual systems, and they play with, I think, sensory gating mechanisms, how much information is the mind allowing in any given moment in time.
Yes. Yeah, I really agree. That's great.
Talking maybe again more concretely, how the DNA revolution will affect our lives. So do you foresee a world where getting your genetics tested is just ubiquitous?
Yes, I do. I don't know if you're old enough to know this iconic science fiction film called Gattaca, G-A-T. Those are the four letters of the DNA alphabet, Gattaca. And it's a catchword now for a dystopian future in which children's fate is sealed at the moment of birth by DNA. It involves testing at birth. And that was a prescient film, 1997 or 6, was about a decade before the DNA revolution. And yet it predicted DNA testing at birth, DNA identification, even DNA testing before birth, prenatal testing as part of in vitro fertilization. And then finally, DNA testing preconceptually, including DNA dating, for example. Well, all of those things are happening right now. DNA identification, it's revolutionized forensics. I could go into that, but it's amazing what it's done to forensics. And DNA testing at birth, we've always tested at birth for 40 years for a handful of single gene disorders, especially, say, phenylketonuria, which used to cause about 1% of cognitively impaired individuals. But for the same cost, you can sequence the whole genome. And that is happening. China right now is attempting to do whole genome sequencing for 50% of all 15 million births a year. And that's because in medicine, as I said, it's kind of a no-brainer that you want to move from waiting till disorders occur and curing them to try to predict and prevent. And DNA is the best early warning system we have because it doesn't change from the moment of conception. So DNA testing at birth is happening. The NHS is like Finland and Estonia now make DNA testing part of their National Health Service. And there's 80 million pounds set aside in the UK to trial this in the UK. But more worryingly for a lot of people is prenatal DNA testing. There's a company now that will actually do DNA testing of embryos to decide, if you do in vitro fertilization, you get about a dozen embryos, and they select on the way the embryos look, how healthy they are, but usually end up with several that are pretty good. And people do this often because they find out that the man and woman are carriers for single gene recessive disorders. Of the thousands of single gene disorders, most of them are recessive, meaning you need a double dose, one from your mother, one from your father. The vast majority of people are carriers. They only have one copy of the mutation, so they don't show the disease. But when they have a child, 25% of the offspring will have a double dose, meaning they have the disorder. So people don't usually find out about single gene disorders until they have a kid who's affected. Then they do in vitro fertilization and they test the embryos to make sure that they select not the 25% of embryos that have a double dose. But you can then go beyond that. Once you've done DNA testing, you can use a SNP chip to get at these hundreds of other traits. So it creates a lot of ethical problems for people, but it's happening already. And there's a company that exists to do that. So that's kind of worrying. But then just one more thing on the preconceptual testing, in Gattaca, it's sort of used as frivolous DNA dating, where couples will want to look at the DNA profiles of a person they're planning to be their partner, which does sound frivolous, but there are a dozen or so companies now, like DNA Romance, and that will do this for people. But George Church at MIT, probably the best known American geneticist, has a company that will do whole genome sequencing for any couple before they get married in order to screen for these single gene mutations. So rather than waiting till you have an affected child, you could screen prospective partners, as Ashkenazi Jews now do for Tay-Sachs. Mm-hmm. And you could George Church says, just about eliminate all these single gene disorders, which apparently cost maybe $1 trillion a year. You know how those estimates go, but it causes a great deal of pain and suffering for people as well, because many of these are horrendous, disorders where kids die horrible deaths early in life. So I'm a cheerleader for these polygenic scores and DNA testing. But the point is, it's happening, like it or not, and we ought to be talking about it and try to maximize the benefits and minimize the weaknesses. And I'm a cheerleader because I can see a lot of advantages.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned dating and you said it's almost frivolous, but I mean, rom-coms make dating look frivolous.
Yeah.
But dating is one of the least frivolous things, I think, in our society, because it's how family units are constructed. Mm-hmm. What are the cautions you think we should start to think about as these processes become more ubiquitous? And do you worry about where this could go in the hands of, let's say, less ethical governments?
Yes. Well, although Gattaca was prescient in terms of predicting the science, I don't believe that the dysgenic prophecy necessarily follows. Most of those sorts of utopias or dystopias are based on totalitarian governments and mostly environmental. If you think of 1984, that wasn't genetic, that was environmental totalitarianism that tried to squash the individual and refused to recognize individual differences, saying that...
Yeah, much like communism.
Yes, I do think so. I'm just reading Wild Swans, which I hadn't read. It's about 20 years old now, but it's amazing about these 3 generations of women that go from, provincial China to the communist revolution and then post-revolution. And it's amazing to see how good it started, what a good thing it was, but then quickly moved to this totalitarian approach where you deny individual differences and you're supposed to pretend that you have no self and all you are is the society, which goes against human nature because there are these genetic differences between people, and it's never going to work if we ignore those differences.
Yeah, and we see this as well with the increasing popularity of social constructionism,
yes,
which would posit that we're primarily who we are as a function of our environment, and that we don't actually have that much innate differences, which obviously is self-evidently not true.
Yeah. So you were asking about cautions, and I think that the idea of a totalitarian government isn't the thing we should be worrying about. I mean, well, yeah, you should worry about totalitarian governments. They're bad. And look at Stalin, Mao, and North Korea. But Gattaca was particularly sophisticated in that, although it looks like a totalitarian government, it's not. This is actually consumer-led. People decide, well, you're going to get a better baby if you do this in vitro fertilization and selection of embryos. And that's what's happening now. I mean, like with Facebook and facial recognition technology, we're buying into this. We accept these things. And I think facial recognition technology, as has gone wild in China, is a lot more dangerous than concerns, say, about DNA. Your DNA being, that people worry about data breaches and that sort of thing. But some people, like George Church, put their entire genome sequence on the web.
Mm-hmm. And you spoke about some of your polygenic risk scores in your book as well.
Yeah. That is a concern about totalitarian governments, but I think the bigger concern is we're doing these things to ourselves. It's consumer-led. It's not a totalitarian government. I find that very interesting. Like the biggest trend now, especially in Southeast Asia, is parents doing DNA testing of their kids. And there's a dozen or so companies, Singapore, but also in mainland China, where they tell parents, we will provide a program of education and training for your kid that's specifically targeted to the kid's strengths and weaknesses. These things really are happening, and we have to be careful about it, especially because the DNA testing industry is completely unregulated. It's a total Wild West. And what appalls me is that all of these companies that provide polygenic scores, there's no one that provides good polygenic scores to the level where they could even get it into a publication in Science, because it's not regulated, and you don't know when you send them your kid's DNA, you don't know the quality of what you're getting back, and they don't even offer good information to interpret it. These are difficult things to interpret, you know?
Would that include companies like 23andMe?
Well, because they got in trouble with the FDA about 7 or 8 years ago, because their marketing strategy was, this is entertainment, sort of. Find out about your ancestry, find out about yourself. The problem was, according to the FDA, they were too good. They were providing information on Alzheimer's and breast cancer that was medical level. And so FDA said, well, if you're providing medical level information, you have to meet medical criteria. And so they had to shut down for a couple of years till they got that together. And as a result, they were burned so badly with that, they're not moving into polygenic scores, which, you know, are really difficult because you're talking about probabilistic risk. But they allow you to download your DNA. You know, 23andMe, if people don't know about it, you pay about £100 and you get ancestry data and information about hundreds of health-related characteristics and some behavioral stuff as well. But they allow you to download with the push of one button your hundreds, actually millions of SNP genotypes. And then there's a dozen or so other companies that allow you to push one button and upload it, and then they provide polygenic scores. The problem is, the polygenic scores they provide are crap, and you don't know that. And it's scandalous because it would take them no extra effort to do it right. These are just, you know, bioinformatic pipelines that you plug the data into. I mean, and so it's just, it's terrible that they're doing this. And
so it sounds like you're advocating for, number one, you know, the individual consumer to really start to think about these things. And I guess that's why you wrote the book, and to think about, you know, what could the impact of these technologies be on their lives. But also you're arguing for much more stringent regulation on these companies, because obviously they have a tremendous responsibility. Have you watched Black Mirror?
I haven't. What is that? I don't even know about it.
Black Mirror is a science fiction show, really in the style of, do you remember that old show, The Twilight Zone?
Oh, yes,
on American television? So it's similar to The Twilight Zone in that each episode is standalone, tells a standalone story, and each episode is based on a particular piece of technology, which is usually an exaggerated form of a technology we already have. And it really captures what you said about how it's normally not a tyrannical government, but rather it's a collection of individuals who are seduced by a particular aspect of an interesting technology without realizing just sort of how pernicious it can be. And then usually the episode, it's a very depressing show, but it's a really good show. And I think it really speaks to what you're talking about. So for example, there's one episode, one of the most powerful episodes, I would say, where the protagonist has a lens embedded in his eye that records his entire life. So at any point he can go back and rewind and rewatch. And in the beginning, you see it has, you know, little utilities and it's very useful. But by the end, it totally drives him crazy because he's obsessed with neurotically going over his past experiences, and it destroys all his relationships. But yeah, I mean, technology in and of itself doesn't have a moral quantity. It's more just how are these technologies used, both by individuals, but also by groups and institutions.
You know, I think it's also true that any big advance in science, this is sort of the, you know, general cop-out in a way, but any advance can be used for good or bad, and it's up to us to try and use it for good rather than bad. And because I don't really trust regulation and I don't trust governments to do a good job at this, I think given that it's consumer-led, I think the way in is to let consumers know they're getting screwed. And I think by naming and shaming these companies, they're going to quickly come around, because it doesn't cost them anymore to do it right, you know, and to provide decent interpretive information. I mean, there's one company that does do it right. It's a nonprofit called imputeme.com. And Catherine Lewis, who's chair of our SGDP department, is an advisor to them. And one of our postdocs, Ollie Payne, is the guy moving this forward. And they really are providing good interpretive information, and they provide these polygenic scores for free. The reason these companies are eager to get your DNA is that DNA is the ultimate big data. When you think about Cambridge Analytica, imagine if they had DNA, what they could do.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's why they want your DNA, and they'll give you something, maybe a glossy looking report, but you don't know that it's garbage.
Mm-hmm. So getting back to clinical psychiatry and psychology, is it fair to say what you foresee is that with these advances in the testing of one's genetics, and particularly inherited DNA differences, we'll be able to come up with individualized patient profiles, which will then be able to lend themselves to very individualized treatment plans. Like, we know this medication might work for this person, or this therapy or this other intervention might work for this patient. Is that what you think it will look like?
Yeah, but even before then, I do think this idea of preventive medicine is an important way to think about it. Because, if, for example, we don't have a very good polygenic score for alcoholism, but it is what it is. I think it accounts for about 4 or 5% of the liability. So
and how heritable is something like alcoholism
it's
typically?
about 40. It depends how you define it and how severe it is, but maybe say 40% heritable. And so if you knew you were at genetic risk, or let's say your child is, first of all, I hope that it doesn't mean they're going to become an alcoholic. It just means, other things being equal, they're at greater risk than someone else. And I think that's useful information for preventing the problem, because what does it cost us, for example, if we're at genetic risk, from doing what we're all supposed to do? Take holidays from booze, monitor your alcohol use, see if you're becoming dependent on it. But with your kids, wouldn't it be worthwhile just saying, you might have a slightly more chance, a greater chance of becoming alcoholic if you go out, as other adolescents do, and get shit-faced. And what does it doesn't cost you that much, to be more sensible about it. And maybe it doesn't work, but having an individual genetic risk score, I think, is useful, because up till now, all genetic risks have been family-wide risks. If you had a father who was alcoholic, as a male, you'd have a 5-fold greater risk of becoming alcoholic. But so would your brother, and so would your sister. So it's a family-wide risk, but that's not nothing. But what if I said, you have a 5-fold risk and your brother doesn't? That's useful individual information, and it might motivate people to pay more attention to the low-tech sort of solutions we're talking about, with preventing alcoholism. Because I do really believe that prevention is so much more effective in every way, economically, socially, and personally, than dramatic cures.
In the beginning of our conversation, you talked about how you initially turned off philosophy and then moved towards something more empirical. And what you're saying is making me think, it's like understanding our biological nature can almost instruct us to create like a personal philosophy, in the sense that a lot of what philosophy is supposed to be is how to live a good life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that involves core concepts like self-awareness, knowing yourself really well, but also having a really good understanding of your strengths and weaknesses, playing to one's strengths as one moves through life, and finding ways to compensate for one's weaknesses. So I think this actually can complement a philosophical view of oneself at an individual level really well.
Yes, well, I like that view of philosophy. I've very belatedly been reading quite a bit about Stoicism now, which I see as just very practical psychology, and
Stoicism, I think CBT is partly derived from Stoic philosophy.
Yes, but when you study philosophy, you get something. Philosophy taken a wrong turn somewhere, and it went very much linguistic, and you know, angels dancing on a pin. And the reason I got out of it is I was at DePaul University in Chicago, and they were big on eidetic reduction and phenomenology. You know, eidetic reduction is getting to the deskness of something. You take away all the features and you get the essence of a deskness. And after hearing about eidetic reduction for about the third time, I kept butting my head against it, saying, "But how do you know if this guy's right or that guy's right?" And I kept thinking of ways, well, you could test it. You could maybe have a bunch of people think about this. And I got such resistance to that until I finally realized that if you can test something, it's no longer philosophy, that sort of philosophy. So that's when I said, well, how do you test these things? And that's psychology. So I just actually left the class at that late night in Chicago in the summer and said, I'm through with philosophy, I'm doing psychology. So I've had this great resistance against that sort of philosophy. But Stoicism, as I say, there is the branch of Stoicism that deals with logic and, you know, formal philosophical issues. But what we're talking about is almost, you know, just practical psychology.
Yes.
And I love that aspect of it. I love it more than the meditation sort of things, which, you know, also have their benefits and they kind of go well with Stoicism. But I do see that I'm more of a practical sort of person. I've just come up with a new theory called, instead of personalized medicine, personalized philosophy. Have you ever noticed that the guys who do meditation, like Sam Harris, who has this wonderful app called Waking Up, are very different than the guys who push, say, Stoicism, like William Irvine, who writes the best about Stoicism, I think, from a practical point of view. There's a recent Sam Harris interview as part of his Making Sense podcast, where they start talking about how they got into these things. And Sam Harris is talking about all his LSD experiences and his, you know, he gets into this thing about there's no self and, you know, interesting notions, but I find it hard to get into that aspect of it. But then here's William Irvine saying, well, he's always been kind of optimistic. Sam is definitely a pessimist. And Irvine also says, you know, he's kind of practical and concrete. He wants, you know, solutions to problems, and he finds Stoicism very useful on that. So I do think there are personality characteristics that predict what kind of philosophy people are going to do. And I've just become convinced recently that I'm a Stoic and I'm not a meditator.
Mm-hmm.
I fall asleep when I meditate.
Fair enough. I mean, I have a lot to say about meditation. We've covered it quite a lot on this podcast, and I actually have used Sam Harris's app and found it really helpful. I think the factor, as far as I can tell, seems to be how esoteric can you get in terms of the ideas and still maintain that level of practicality.
Yes.
So someone like Sam can talk about the idea of not having a self, and I've had to listen to him talk about it a few times, but he still maintains that clear path from that esoteric idea to practicality, and this is how it's going to help me in my life.
Yes.
So I think when he's talking about the notion of not having a self, as he discovers through meditation practice, I think what he means is the narrative that we're constantly constructing in our minds about who we are and how we came to this point is largely an illusion. And it's an illusion that can help us, but also it's an illusion that can hold us back. Because every interaction, every situation we find ourselves in, we imagine ourselves as this protagonist at the center of a story. And that, of course, isn't true, and can lead to emotional reactions, feelings of injustice, say, or anger, or anxiety, or existential fear that can be unhelpful and prevent us from achieving what we actually want.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a bit of a digression.
Have you lost yourself?
I have had some interesting experiences with meditation where I feel I'm pretty sure that's what they're referring to as a sense of selflessness, by which, if I can try and talk about it as concretely as possible, it's like you can feel your body, you can feel your emotions, you can perceive your thoughts, but that's it. you're nothing besides this phenomenological experience of those things, and of course your environment as well, and your other sensory stimulations. But if you look closely, there isn't anything besides that. But when you collapse into a normal state of consciousness, there is this niggling sense that you're this person riding around in your body.
Yes.
And it's only when you look that that sense disappears.
Yes. Well, I've been through the 25 introductory, 10-minute sessions, so I've got a long way to go with his Waking Up app. And I will persist because I do like it, and I find it sort of useful as a relaxation technique, if nothing else. But I have a little trouble following him down this rabbit hole of determinism, that there is no free will. I sort of get it at one sort of philosophical level. But anyway, that's another huge story, I'm sure. But people might be interested to follow Sam Harris down these rabbit holes about there is no free will.
Yes. Well, Robert, I've taken up a lot of your time. Is there what take-home messages would you like to leave our listeners with?
Well, no, I think we've covered a lot, but I think the take-home message is the title of the book. I think Blueprint, that is, DNA, is the major systematic force making us who we are. The environment's important, but it doesn't work the way we thought it worked. It's not nurture in the sense of systematic effects of family environment. It's what we call non-shared environment, but that's basically chance, idiosyncratic, stochastic sorts of experiences. And it's a whole new way of thinking about the environment. Not to say the environment's unimportant, but it just doesn't work the way Freud and other people told us it worked. So I think that's important. And then the third thing is what I call the nature of nurture. That is, what looks like systematic effects of the environment are actually genetic effects in disguise to a large extent. Genetics mediates the correlations between environment and outcome. So if you put those together, you get what I'm talking about, which is inherited DNA differences are the major systematic force making us who we are as individuals.
Yes, and we should really make an effort to get to know who we are, to understand our nature, so that we can work with it to navigate, through the problems in life.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Robert. You're welcome back anytime.
Well, Alex, it was great talking to you, and it would be nice maybe to carry on with this conversation at some point, depending on what kind of reaction you get from your listeners. They may have heard more than they want to know about this.
Well, we'll find out.
Great talking to you.
Great.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love it if you share it with a friend, or you could give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee to support the team, and the links for that will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.